Hey everyone, welcome to Movie Marathons HQ, where we do movie marathons connected to new releases and where we enjoy and review some of our favorite movies. This video is part of the Spider-Man Brand New Day Movie Marathon, where we are watching one movie every week as we prepare for the release of Spider-Man Brand New Day in July 2026. It's also part of the Avengers Doomsday Movie Marathon, where we're doing the same thing until the release of Avengers Doomsday in December 2026. Today we are discussing Spider-Man 3. Released in 2007 and directed by Sam Raimi, this is the third and final installment of the Raimi Spider-Man trilogy. Overall, we all know that this movie is not good. However, I do want to dig a little bit deeper into that. I often hear the narrative that Spider-Man 3 failed because of studio interference. I know that that is true, but I think that's a bit of a narrow-minded way to look at it. I think there are some things that do work in this movie that I'll want to discuss, and then I'll want to discuss why the things that don't work. I do remember seeing this movie in theaters, and I got the ick in the theater in the moment as it was happening. Is particularly the infamous scene where Tobey Maguire as Peter Parker has been taken over by the Venom symbiote, and he's doing his finger guns and trying to woo women in the street. And I remember even as a teenager seeing that in the theaters and immediately getting turned off from the movie. I think that's how most people felt about it. But in this review, I do want to talk a little bit about some of those details of what works and what doesn't work. So for positives, I'll want to talk about some of the visual effects, especially most of what they did with the Sandman. Some of the casting, which actually is very good. The score by Christopher Young. In this movie, Danny Elfman did not return after having scored the previous two Spider-Man movies, but Christopher Young steps in and did a really good job, I think. And one of the villains is a positive. For negatives, some of the visual effects as well are pretty terrible, especially there are some moments in the last big action scene that just feel like a video game. Some other parts of the casting would really miss the mark. All of the retcons that are introduced in this movie that feel really jarring. The cheesiness of the story and tone, which has been a negative of the other two movies, so it is consistent. But especially like just the tone of this movie and how the plot and storylines all mix together, which is a super huge negative that we'll discuss. Spoiler alert for Spider-Man 3. So first, some of the visual effects are really good, particularly everything that they did with the Sandman, from his origin, where he's in the outdoor kind of testing thing and he gets ripped apart by this machine, then to how he comes together and how the grains of sand all move and look like they have weight and they take up space. It's very well done. And then when Sandman fights Spider-Man and he takes a punch to the gut and sand spurts out the back, and then when he's his face is dragged against the underground subway car and there's grains of sand getting pulled off him, it looks really good. Most of the stuff that they do with Sandman. So there's some other visual effects throughout the movie. The web swinging and a lot of the action still looks very good. So you've got to mention that as a positive. Next, the musical score. I really enjoyed the musical scores by Danny Elfman in Spider-Man 1 and 2, and he decided not to come back, it's said because of creative differences, and that's sometimes hard to know what that means in Hollywood language. But Christopher Young stepped in, and I think the score for Spider-Man 3 is just as strong as the scores for 1 and 2. There's some really cool and really memorable musical movements as we get introduced to the black suit Spider-Man that kind of comes back throughout the movie. And I think that's a really strong addition, but it's a very strong score, just like the first two. And some of the casting, a lot of the returning cast from previous movies still does well here, like J. Jonah Jameson, played by J.K. Simmons, and Betty Brant, played by Elizabeth Banks. They've got a little bit more to do, and they do a great job. Rosemary Harris as Aunt May. I hadn't mentioned her in the previous two reviews, but she's very strong as the archetypal Aunt May character. She's got some moments here where she flexes some acting chops. But one of the new additions, Thomas Hayden Church, playing Flint Marko and the Sandman, he's really strong. He looks like he's conflicted. He looks like he's got weight on his shoulders. with everything that goes on with him as a character. He looks the part. He looks really, really good just straight from the comics. Part of that is the costuming, and his simple black striped T-shirt just is ripped from the comics, and it's very effective on screen. So some of the casting here is positive. And this last positive about the villain kind of goes into what I was saying about the Sandman. Flint Marko is a pretty interesting villain. He's not just a bad guy for bad guy's sake. He had a backstory. He had a family he was fighting for, and he made some mistakes for sure, but a lot of Spider-Man has been about redemption in the comics, and so this character kind of embodies that. It seems like he was a victim of circumstance, even in the way he got his sand manipulation powers. Wasn't really his choice, and it just happened to him. So I think he's a strong villain. He's probably not as strong as Green Goblin and Dr. Octopus from the previous two movies, but still he holds his own in this movie as a really interesting and compelling villain. Now we get to the negatives. Some of the visual effects are also pretty bad, especially I noticed in the last scene where the giant sand creature is fighting Venom, and then Goblin shows up, and Black Suit Spider-Man is there, and Mary Jane is there. There's some really bad visual effects there. One that really stood out was where Spider-Man has supposedly spun a web for him and MJ to lay on, and in some scenes it looked practical, in other scenes it looks CGI, in other scenes it looks practical, and then back to the same scene that is kind of the same direction, the camera placement seems similar, then it looks CGI all of a sudden. So yeah, there's lots of moments that felt like a video game. Some of the times that Venom is swinging around and doing his thing just looks pretty bad, like a video game cutscene. So although some of the visual effects were great where we see Sandman, there's other moments where they're not so great. The next negative is the casting. I think everybody knows that Topher Grace was very miscast as Eddie Brock Jr. and Venom. He's not the right size of an actor that you need for that character. He's also not the right demeanor of a character, and I don't know what they were looking for in the audition process, but the demeanor of Eddie Brock doesn't work in this movie, I think. It also isn't consistent with what we've seen in the comics. And in this Spider-Man Brand New Day movie marathon, we have already reviewed the 3 Venom movies with Tom Hardy. And although I don't love those movies, I think he's very strong as Eddie Brock. Here, however, our first crack at the bat in 2007, where we saw Topher Grace in that role, was just terrible. I don't know how much that is his fault or not. He just, to me, came across as punchable, is the best description, and it didn't provide a really strong foil to Peter. I think that's what they were going for, but it didn't come across. And a lot of that has to do with the casting. We also see Bryce Dallas Howard as Gwen Stacy. I am interested in Gwen Stacy being introduced here. And she's maybe not terrible. She's not given much to do except scream. And then she has the scene where she has the kiss with Spider-Man that creates some drama with Mary Jane. Very understandable drama, I might add, which we'll get into later. So Bryce Dallas Howard isn't necessarily terrible, but I threw that in here too with the casting because she's a new cast member who just doesn't add much to the story. So again, the casting is a negative. There are some obvious retcons in this movie that just don't sit very well with me, particularly that Flint Marko was the real criminal in the death of Uncle Ben. It just seems very shoehorned in just to give something for this movie to do. I know it's supposed to give some tension for Peter, and I'm interested in Peter Parker having tension in his life. This one just felt very, very forced and not very natural. And then there's also just some continuity things that don't make a lot of sense. Specifically, at the end of Spider-Man 2, Harry Osborn, played by James Franco, he finds his way into his father's little goblin lair in their mansion home. So he discovers, wow, my father was the Green Goblin. And in there's a glider, and there's a bunch of pumpkin bombs, and there's a mask, and all these things. Then in Spider-Man 3, we get New Goblin, is what they call him in the credits, and he's not flying a glider, he's flying what they called a sky stick. I just don't understand how Harry could have ever engineered a flying snowboard like that. He says all the time in the previous 2 movies that he needed Peter's help to get him through high school science. And then are we supposed to believe that he's just got this in there? So either that means that Norman made it and left it in that little goblin cubby hole, or Harry made it, which doesn't seem to make sense. So maybe that's not a retcon, but just some inconsistency that stood out to me. That was another negative. Next is the cheesiness of the story and the dialogue. While the other two Spider-Man movies have been very cheesy, this one really takes it up a notch. I mentioned before the scene with Peter and the finger guns walking through the street is very cheesy, and then him dancing in the jazz studio is very cheesy. But the tone of this movie is also the main negative. It kind of goes all over the place. But I do want to go through a few of the main storylines of this movie and see what parts of them work, which parts of them don't work, and then which ones work together and don't work together. So I want to break down Spider-Man 3 into some of its storyline parts. First is the Harry New Goblin storyline. I think this is actually a natural next step for the character. In the first one, he's friends with Peter. In the second one, and he discovers that he thinks that Peter is the cause of his father's death at the end of the first one. So the second one, he's got this vendetta against Spider-Man, and he's antagonistic towards Peter because Peter must know who Spider-Man is because of the pictures he's taking. Then at the end, he finds out it's Peter. So then now I feel like he does have this angst and this frustration and this anger where he feels compelled to go after Spider-Man and Peter because he feels betrayed. I think that's a pretty natural storyline. There's some parts of the execution of it that don't work, but I think that storyline is pretty natural as a next step for the character. I don't think it works where he hits his head on the post and he loses his memory, and then he's back to the old Harry, and then him and MJ, played by Kirsten Dunst, kiss, and that causes a rift, and then like he gets his memory back, and then he tries to mess with Peter by telling him that him and MJ are together. That whole part of it doesn't work, I don't think. I think the evolution of his character and trying to feel like he has a duty to his father, whose love he never really got, to like seek vengeance against Peter, his best friend, and Spider-Man, by whom he feels betrayed. That's really cool. But this memory thing and his petty little, love triangle, I just think that whole part of that story doesn't work. I mentioned before, but I do think the Sandman storyline works pretty much as it is throughout the whole movie. How he comes to be and how he is just trying to figure things out, and Spider-Man keeps trying to stop him and he doesn't want to be stopped. I don't like the retcon that they put in there, but I think that storyline does actually work. And then the symbiote storyline, how this symbiote kind of crashed and then takes over people, and I like that in the story, Peter is battling his own darkness because the person who caused the death of his dear Uncle Ben is still out there. So he feels like he doesn't actually have justice, the whole thing that set him on the Spider-Man journey. So he's got this darkness within him, and all the tumult he's going through with his relationship with MJ in his personal life, he's got all this darkness. So when the symbiote attaches to him, it amplifies this darkness. And I think that actually works quite well. I don't think it's terrible. It does completely miss the mark, of course, as we get later. And then it's really frustrating how he decides to kiss Gwen Stacy out in public as Spider-Man, knowing that MJ is there. That just seems like a dirtbag move. It's not a symbiote thing. He's just being a terrible person. So I can't really attribute that part to the symbiote, but generally, I think the symbiote storyline, as far as it connects to Peter Parker, I think that does actually work. Where the symbiote storyline doesn't work is when Venom is introduced. Eddie Brock's character didn't really work anyways, and then his anger at Peter for exposing him for using Photoshop or being a fraud in his newspaper image, that's not even justifiable. He cheated and Peter exposed him. So maybe Peter did it in an unkind way, but still Eddie's in the wrong. So he's all mad at Peter, like so much that he wants to end his life. But I don't think that's justified. And then the symbiote kind of comes off of Peter and happens to drop down and hit Eddie. So I guess Eddie's got not the same, but some darkness in him, and then it's amplified even worse, but I just don't think that's justified. And then that whole part where Venom is introduced just doesn't have time to breathe. I know people like to say, well, the studio made Sam Raimi use Venom. there is a good Venom story that could be told within these component parts, and it just wasn't executed. Um, so it's frustrating, and that whole part doesn't work the way it's put into this movie. But I do think that that storyline of the symbiote did work if it had ended there. Or I suppose if the screenwriting and directing team had come up with a better way to position Eddie to take the symbiote, or have him have more to do in the earlier part of the movie so it feels justified revealing him at the end. And finally, MJ's storyline. She's finally on Broadway. So Peter is there for her and celebrating, and she's doing well, and they have this supposedly healthy relationship. Then she's fired, but she doesn't tell Peter. And then he feels like he wants to propose, but then MJ's moody because Peter's not available for her. But she knows he's Spider-Man at this point. She learned that in the last movie, and then she even says she always kind of knew that that was what was going on. So she's all moody. He tries to propose to her because I guess he thinks he should, but I don't really know why he wants to. And then she says no, and that's just this big thing in there. And then whatever the timing is, but then Peter has kissed Gwen, and MJ knows that that was Peter. That wasn't Spider-Man, that was Peter. And that was also their upside down kiss that they shared. Like, how did Peter think that was ever going to fly or ever be a good thing to do? If he's supposed to be a morally upright hero, that's not it. I don't know why that character would have made that choice. So then, and then MJ, kind of in retaliation, maybe cheats on Peter with Harry, who's Peter's former best friend, and she knows that things aren't well with him. This is just such a toxic relationship in these three movies. I think from beginning to end, this entire relationship does not work, which is insane because the Peter and MJ romance is one of the strongest in all of comics. And yet in this movie trilogy, Sam Raimi just, I think, botches it in every way possible. So I don't think the MJ storyline works in the context of this movie either. It does, I'll admit, give Peter some of that angst that is amplified by the Venom symbiote. But I just think a lot of it is contrived and just there because it's in the script and it doesn't feel natural. And then ultimately, I think these characters would be so much better off apart. I don't think they work as a couple. I don't think they ever worked as a couple the way that they've been written and the way that they've been acted. So I think that's the biggest negative in this movie. To give a moment to talk about the suit, the red and blue suit is not very much changed from the first two movies, but I think that the black Spider-Man suit in Spider-Man 3 actually looks better in this movie than it does in the comics. In the comics, when it was introduced in the Secret Wars storyline, it's just a black suit with a white spider-ish looking symbol, but it's just pure black. There's no definition, there's no contour, there's no texture. It's just a black suit. Here in this movie, he's still got, it's like the black has seeped into the fabric, but the raised webbing is still there. And it's almost like a charcoal gray black underneath the raised webbing. And I think it actually looks phenomenal. I think the black suit Spider-Man in Spider-Man 3 looks really, really good. And then the Venom suit, once the symbiote gets attached to Eddie, mimics the Spider-Man suit, which is how it was in the comics. I don't really know why that makes sense and why this alien symbiote cares so much about a spider motif, but in this movie, the Venom suit mimics the raised webbing, but instead of being nice orderly lines as it is on Spider-Man, it's chaotic and irregular and not patterned, which I think works for the character. And I think Venom actually looks pretty good. His face doesn't look good and his head is too small, partially because Topher Grace doesn't have a big enough build to make Venom large enough. He just looks like a small, slender, slim man. So I don't think that part works, but I do think the black Spider-Man suit looks really good here. Now, how might Spider-Man 3 connect to Spider-Man Brand New Day? None of the actors in this movie are on the cast list for Spider-Man Brand New Day, so I don't expect to see any of them as a cameo. Tobey Maguire, however, does return as Spider-Man in Spider-Man No Way Home, which was wonderful. And also the villain of Sandman does come back in that movie, so we do see Thomas Hayden Church again. I also forgot to mention we do see Green Goblin and Doc Ock in Spider-Man No Way Home. Some people think that Tobey Maguire is going to be in Avengers Secret Wars. I don't think that'll be the case yet, but since we haven't seen Doomsday and we don't know exactly what the story is there, it's hard to know what Secret Wars will be about. But some people think that Tobey Maguire will come back again as Spider-Man in either of those two Avengers movies. I don't think so at this point. So that's my review of Spider-Man 3. What do you think of this movie, and how do you think it might connect to Spider-Man Brand New Day or Avengers Doomsday? Make sure to let me know in the comments below. Follow Movie Marathons HQ on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, and also on Letterboxd, where you can see all of the movie marathons we have going on right now. The next movie in this marathon is The Amazing Spider-Man. See you at the movies!